What's up, everybody? It is Emmett, your nuclear barbarian, here with another installment of the weekly Nuclear Barbarians podcast. Today, we are going to return to our theme of RTOs, Regional Transmission Organizations, and what it does to nuclear. And I've brought somebody on to talk about that, my new buddy, Aidan Swanson. How's it going, man?
Good. It's going great.
So before we get into this research you've just done, I wanted to learn a little bit about you. What's your deal? Where are you from?
Well, yeah,
What's going on?
I'll get into it. Well, thank you for having me on. I am from Omaha, Nebraska. I grew up here and partially in Dublin, Ireland as well. So I really appreciate your episode about Irish.
Oh,
Yeah, my mom's from Dublin. So kind of went back and forth as a kid. But yeah, I would say, well, I'm a senior undergrad here at Creighton University, and I got into nuclear in a little bit of a roundabout way. But originally, I was on the Andrew Yang campaign in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and I heard him talking about thorium. And I was like, this seems really interesting. And I was trying to learn everything I possibly could about Yang. And I went down a thorium YouTube rabbit hole and like sat in the library for like 5 hours just watching these YouTube videos. And yeah, so I worked on the Yang campaign. I was pretty vocal about nuclear through that. Love Andrew. I know he's very pro-nuclear. One
that's
time
right.
I
He
went up to
is.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went up to him at a conference and I was like, "Hey, thank you for supporting nuclear. We really need that in our for our future." And he goes, "Yeah, without nuclear, we're completely effed." And I was like, "Yep, all right, that's my guy."
Cool.
So yeah, he's a really cool guy. And then since then, I've just been doing advocacy work locally, talking to everybody I can, going to some environmental marches, finding out that nuclear is not always accepted by the mainstream environmentalists. And every single paper I've written in college has to do with energy or nuclear. Every class, I turn it into a nuclear energy class. So
Amazing.
yeah, it's a bit about me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that's really exciting. It's cool to see this. I was actually just talking to Heather Hoff yesterday, actually. I guess the episode comes out tomorrow, about how excited we both are that there's this new crop of young people coming up who don't have
Yeah.
all these Cold War fears
Oh
of
yeah.
nuclear and are pretty stoked on it. So it sounds like you fit right into that demographic, which is rad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, and around campus, people like literally know me as the nuclear energy guy. I wear my shirts everywhere. And I think every single one of my friends is a little bit tired of the nuclear discussion. But yeah, it is shocking the level of acceptance and just the general, I think from kids my age, they literally just don't understand why someone would not be in favor of nuclear
Yeah.
power, which
Hmm.
is like very encouraging to hear after my run-ins with people who are like very gassed at why someone would be in favor of nuclear power. And so I think a lot of kids my age are, something I talk about a lot is like by 2050, when we're supposed to reach the net zero to like
Hmm.
be for our young generation future, anything built in the Green New Deal in terms of variable renewable energy will not be existing. We're going to have to do it all over again
Right.
if we build it today. So I think that sense of like enduring security that a 60 to 80-year life of a nuclear power plant gives is really appealing for kids my age. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And I think, yeah, and whether or not it can even be extended beyond 80 years, I mean, we don't
right.
know yet, which
Yeah.
is, it'll be exciting when we find out because we will
Yeah.
win. Yeah, so let's get into this research that
Hmm.
you've just completed. You reached out to me, I think, a few months ago and said you were looking at decommissionings, and then your research started to shift into some other areas. So, what'd you look into and what'd you find out?
Yeah. So originally it was really about decommissionings, but and I wanted the dependent variable to be really more nuclear specific, but that ended up just having a whole lot of data problems. And so I ended up discussing clean electricity production in general. And so looking at some explanatory factors for that. and looking how nuclear played into that in all 48 states, and then parsing the states out by regulated and deregulated states. And I know you just had Meredith on to talk about this a little bit, and I tweeted at her a few times and got her input, so that was great. She's great. So
she's so generous.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So essentially, I ran a time series regression analysis on annual electricity production in state, with the dependent variable being clean electricity production as a percent of the total in-state production. And in all 48 states, deregulated states had 8.5% less of their energy from clean sources. And now, of course, there's interconnections that go into that, and not all electricity produced in a single state is consumed in that state.
Sure.
But it was general. And yeah, and then I think two of probably the most interesting pieces that I found, and something that I was really trying to expose. I mean, obviously you're not supposed to go into research with necessarily preconceptions, but I mean, I think the literature is very supportive of this. So it was part of my hypothesis, but that natural gas pricing in deregulated states, because as we all know, natural gas has a lot of synergies with integrating renewable energy onto the grid. And in the deregulated states, generally, the production is profitability dependent. So you've got, if the natural gas price is high, one would assume that less natural gas would be used in a deregulated state, or at least the use of that would be less attractive. And so I found that like a $1 increase in the price of natural gas resulted in a 1.14% decrease in electricity from clean sources, essentially saying that in deregulated states, their clean electricity is dependent, or at least in some sense dependent upon low natural gas prices, which I found very interesting. And that was significant to the 95% level. And then in regulated states, the natural gas price was not significant to any level, which was the only independent variable that was not significant to any level. So I had 7 independent variables, and in all 48 states, then the regulated model and the deregulated model. So there are 21 observations throughout the 3 models, and natural gas price was the only one that wasn't significant to any level in regulated states. So to me, that says that in non-RTO states, you have a system that is less reliant upon low natural gas prices. And in seeing the precipitous rise in natural gas prices recently, I think this paradigm of low natural gas prices acting as a crutch for renewable integration might be over, which, I mean, I don't want to speak in absolutes, of course, but I do think that that's going to be a huge factor in the coming years as we try to progress the energy transition. So
that is some pretty fantastic information. So, I mean, I'm thinking a few things when I hear that, right? One of them is that the arguments that people tend to make about the advantages RTOs offer renewables doesn't necessarily mean that those renewables will decarbonize the grid to the extent that advocates say.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, if you just look at the descriptive statistics of the regulated versus deregulated states, the mean of the electricity price, which has been demonstrated many a time, that the deregulated states had almost a whole dollar, their per kilowatt hour price to retail electricity was $1 higher than the regulated states. And now, of course, there's a lot of other factors that could go into that.
Sure.
And regulated states in the Northwest tend to have a lot of hydro, and Idaho has a lot of geothermal, and so does Utah. And those are kind of geographically dependent. But yeah, I found that really fascinating. And further, in regulated states, available nuclear capacity, a 100 megawatt increase in available nuclear capacity in a state saw a 0.58% rise in clean electricity, as opposed to the deregulated states, which saw a 0.29% rise. So if you have, at least this is what the research is showing, and of course it's not encompassing of every factor, you would see that regulated states incorporate nuclear capacity more efficiently into their grid, considering that the same increase in nuclear capacity is correlated with a higher percentage increase from clean electricity. And so a lot of that, I think, has, in my opinion, and previous research and opinions describe, you've got this integrated resource plan, and renewables inherently are difficult to integrate onto the grid. When you have a large capacity source like nuclear, if you can plan around that in a vertically integrated model, I think that is more efficient for creating synergies between nuclear and renewables. So, yeah.
So why is it that the vertically integrated situation works better? In this case, I mean, I don't want to say like in every single case, just to qualify that.
For sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I think both models are, flawed to a certain extent. I mean, nothing is perfect, but
yeah, we're really talking about trade-offs, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's everything with policy. Like, any policy implemented is going to have new problems. You just hope that those problems are more fixable than the previous problems. And I think people don't really accept that no policy is a silver bullet. But in, I think there's a paper written about, forget the author right now, but it was really instrumental in my understanding of price floors and the pricing mechanisms in the wholesale electricity market. And so when you have renewables that can bid in at $0, eventually in a deregulated wholesale market, you have, if you get up to a certain level of renewable penetration, you reach a place where there's no one to provide a price floor for those renewable energies, and they eventually price themselves out of the market. And so, yeah, I find that in vertically integrated models, you can more efficiently integrate renewables because you're able to take into account for the larger capacity of nuclear. And I think that's something that we've seen has forced nuclear out of economic competition in the deregulated markets because of that, because nobody can compete with $0 bids into the market. That's just not sustainable.
Or we pay you bids into the market. Right. It's hard to top that. Yeah. The thing where the price floor thing is interesting, is that similar to, or is that basically just to the situation in California where it's like there's so much solar going at once that everybody's like, yeah, what do we do with this actually?
Yeah. So, yeah, I found the paper. Jorge Blasquez, The Renewable Energy Policy Paradox. And yeah, in California, ultimately it's all balancing the grid is about matching demand with supply. And you've got supply in the middle of the day, and everybody knows about the duck curve, and you're trying to shift that forward into the night. And so these wholesale markets ultimately, you see how cheap people will talk about how cheap renewable energy is. And I think in my understanding of the situation, it's cheap for me, but not cheap for you. And I think the reason for these deregulated markets is that it allows the marginal cost of production to play a bigger role in the market rather than a long run average total cost, in which a vertically integrated utility could, eat some of the, or absorb some of the short-term fluctuations in the market in order
Mm,
for long-term stability. And
gotcha.
right now, the wholesale markets are not necessarily adequately providing that stability. So
Wow. So that's really fascinating. I mean, it's sort of amazing to watch this experiment come apart.
yeah,
It seems like there is great hope for what the RTO could bring to the grid, the problems it could solve, which aren't fake problems, by the way. Right. Problems with incumbent
yeah,
utilities not living up to their end of the bargain or becoming corrupt or becoming a predatory monopoly or whatever. I don't want to just dismiss the people who implemented this as nothing but cynical opportunists who
right.
conspired to destroy the grid. I don't think that's helpful.
Yeah.
Right?
And I mean, like, if you look at really a lot of the, you go back to Point Beach 1 and 2, I think that was the reactors that's often described by Brett Kugelmass had a description of Point Beach 1 and 2 and just how incredibly cheap they were compared to modern reactors.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the Alara as low as reasonably achievable. That oh gosh, what's the word I'm thinking of? As low as reasonably achievable, that mandate, ultimately in a vertically integrated utility, it's a lot easier to pass off increased costs for nuclear in
Yeah.
terms of like a double containment or other such, in my opinion, kind of superfluous
Safety regs.
those safety regs. If you get a fixed rate of return and you're like, well, this is necessary to achieve as low as reasonably achievable in a vertically integrated utility model, you would assume, and you saw that in the 80s, a lot of the rising costs of nuclear can be associated with that vertically integrated model. So, in some sense, you might say that economic competitiveness in a wholesale market might help reduce those regulatory pressures. But of course, it doesn't, because the regulatory body isn't trying to maximize profit for the nuclear power
Mm-hmm.
plant. They're just trying to regulate it to be safe,
Mm-hmm.
which, of course, is their job. But those regulations aren't going to go away just because now nuclear has to compete in the
Compete.
wholesale market. So in some ways, I wish, or you could imagine a scenario in which nuclear is forced to compete. They become more nimble and more streamlined in their regulatory processes, but that just hasn't really been the case. And I think post Fukushima, I don't know, it's gotten even worse in some senses. But
Right. I think Adam Stein, Ted Norhaus, and a few others at BTI have been doing a great job of covering NuScale's struggles with the
yeah,
NRC's approval process, which
yeah,
seems like a nightmare to me. Like every time I read one of the
yeah,
BTI blog updates, I'm just like, ooh.
yeah. That's that's kind of why I fall really in the more traditional BWR PWR camp of reactors that already have regulatory understanding. I
Mhm.
think right now the NRC is going through a little bit of a situation in which they're trying to grapple around these new SMR technologies. How do we regulate them? Do they need a full like containment zone around them? Not a containment zone. I forget the word, but yeah, yeah.
Like it,
So
I mean, they're new technologies, so that's going to
yeah,
create difficulties in any regulatory body, but especially one that is, I mean, frankly, kind of antagonistic as the
yeah,
NRC in terms of what decisions it's going to make, how quickly it can make those decisions, and how motivated it feels to resolve these issues. When you only
yeah,
have the Sierra Club and the NRDC showing up to some of your public comment, like
yeah,
situations, you're getting the worst of the worst information on what you should do and the worst of the worst
right,
feedback on it.
yeah. So yeah, I think it'll certainly be interesting to see where it goes over the next few years in terms of licensing. But yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you this. What's next for you in terms of things you want to look at with nuclear? Like, did this research set any other things off in your head where you're like, oh, I need to look at this now?
I think in some ways it kind of solidified a lot of my understanding and thesis around investing in nuclear. And I think
Mm-hmm.
if I were to be completely honest, what's next for me, I've been doing a lot of investing in nuclear technologies. I mean, specifically uranium. That's really one of the only ways that you can get there. So
Mm-hmm.
post grad, I'm probably going to do that full time work on the side and also do like my own type of nuclear advocacy, travel around the country and hopefully buy a van and get out there, go hopefully save Diablo Canyon before it's too late, do stuff like that.
That's
But
awesome.
yeah, I mean, just furthering my understanding of the sector is something that I've always wanted. And I think this research has definitely opened up so many different paths that I thought I knew a lot about. But of course, I mean, in anything, you only have scratched the surface in
Sure.
terms of learning everything you can.
You
So
can
yeah,
drill down as far as you're willing to.
right, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah. So I have sort of a generational question to ask you.
mhm.
I see, help me, I'm an old millennial. I'm a crypt keeper on the internet,
Yeah,
ancient as it is. And I feel like I've noticed two dominant strains in how your generation Zoomers feel about the future. And one, this tends to come out of people who were involved with the Gang campaign or things like it, is
yeah.
very can do, very positive, like really excited to solve problems. And then there
Hmm.
seems to be another very frightened of these problems and very pessimistic about anyone's ability to solve anything. Is that a correct read on the divide I'm seeing here?
I would definitely say so. I think the whole Greta Thunberg sunrise movement, that is, it's almost just like laying down and throwing up your hands and like
Mm-hmm.
the experiment of modernity like is over before
Mm-hmm.
we've even tried to continue it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for myself and my brother, who is an environmental biologist getting his
Mm-hmm.
master's degree out in Colorado, I think this idea of like constant pessimism and this clash between what might be seen as traditional environmentalism, which is industrialism is bad
Mm-hmm.
and we can't coexist. The problems of modernity got us in this and we can't get out of it using those avenues. I think that is really tiring for people who like really want to solve the problems. And I think there's a path dependency that we're on right now.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not you like the idea of living by yourself in a commune where you grow your own food and whatever,
Mm-hmm.
9 to 10 billion people in the world cannot do that.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's impossible for every person to do that. I mean, you can go do that because you live in a wealthy country and you have that privilege, but not everybody can do that. And if we're looking to feed this many people and have everybody have a decent standard of living, we can't go backwards. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, I definitely think that that is something that I struggle with. I think I'm pretty optimistic about the
Mm-hmm.
future. I think, I personally struggle with like looking at the trend of humanity getting wealthier and wealthier and people rising out of poverty, life expectancy rising. And
Mm-hmm.
then I dug deep into one sector in terms of like energy. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, what are we doing? Like, we're all so stupid. Like
Yeah.
this is, and so I think in some ways that is a little,
It's disconcerting.
yeah, especially when I'm like, how many other sectors do I think that were, do I think that the answer is like plain and clear? And then if I were to dig down, turns out that everybody's just messing it up. But I think the wisdom of the crowds, and I think like the idea that people feel like we're messing it up is an integral part of getting better.
Yes. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's true too. What both of the strands have in common is, I think, a healthy skepticism of existing institutions and how they're
Hmm.
discharging their duties.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I don't, I still feel that my generation is like far more open to different ideas, but I do think that it's going to take a while before
Yeah. Well, and you don't
things
want to
can.
do the thing either where I think this was a mistake that previous generations have made where it's sort of easy to be like, well, the kids get it, so they'll solve it.
Right.
We can't
Yeah.
have that type of mentality. That's what's so wonderful about you and I talking and you
Hmm.
consulting with Meredith on some things,
Yeah.
is that this really needs to be an intergenerational moment, because generational politics really only get you so far. They become a meme very,
Hmm.
very easily. And it stops
Yeah.
feeling like you live in a society where like everyone has duties
Yeah.
and responsibilities
Yeah.
to each other, you know?
Yeah. And in in many ways, I think everybody kind of feels this way about politics right now, and just that everybody's looking for like the easy solution, the buzzword. I was listening to AOC talk about the Keystone XL pipeline,
Mm-hmm.
and she goes, "The reason we built the Keystone X pipeline is to export natural gas abroad." And that's something that she really said. And the Keystone XL pipeline is primarily to import oil from Canada, not
Yeah.
natural gas, not to export it abroad. And I'm like, this is the woman who wrote the Green New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and and many people feel is
Yeah,
the
leading
leader in
voice on
terms of
this. Yeah.
our energy future. And that was just shocking to me. Like
Mm-hmm.
I got like incredibly upset. I was like, what are we doing here? And a lot of my friends just felt like, just shut up. Like, okay, whatever. But we do need like a real sense of moderating, intelligent, like uh voice that is not going to play the political partisanship game, and is gonna like do what's right regardless of whether it follows the party lines. And I think that's why I felt so strongly about Yang. I didn't agree with all of his policies, but
Sure.
I felt that he was a discerning individual at
Mm-hmm.
least. And yeah,
Well,
so
he was obviously inspiring to everybody that worked for him.
yeah,
You know,
for
I
sure.
mean, when I live out in LA, and every time I saw Yang campaign stuff, because there was a bunch of it out of here, like everyone was just pumped.
Yeah.
Like they were very enthusiastic. And when I look at all of this, I think you're right that we need people who are moderate, or I would say sober in their psychology
Yeah.
about what's going on. We don't want to fall into the golden mean fallacy where whatever is moderate in the
Yeah.
middle is
Yeah.
necessarily right. But we want somebody who has prudence, right? Who
Hmm.
has the virtues of leadership. But
Yes.
we would also need, and I think this is what's inspiring to me about your work and the things you want to do, is an increase in energy literacy in general. Like,
Yeah.
the way energy is has been so memeified that it feels impossible for a lot of people to get into it or to understand it, or they think they already know
Yeah.
because of the way it's been memed. So I'm hoping that, I mean, I feel like there's going to be a return to energy politics over the next five to
Oh, for
10
sure.
years.
Yes.
And I hope that's a great opportunity for us to increase our understanding of just energy system basics. Not everybody needs to be an expert, but we could stand to have a better handle society wide on what the hell we're actually doing with things
Right.
like the grid.
Yeah. And I think the rise in the gas prices is like just the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of what I think is going to be people having far more awareness of where their energy comes from, what energy is, what a kilowatt hour is. Like there's so many things on TikTok already of just like people talking, like young kids talking about making jokes about the high gas prices. And
Yeah.
for years, that was something that like nobody really even thought of, nobody talked about. And like to me, that is just the beginning of people coming to recognize that energy rules everything and
Mm-hmm.
paying attention to energy policy and maybe like stopping the Keystone XL pipeline might have a great veneer of morality and whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
if we see these continued rise in oil prices, I don't know how many people are gonna all of a sudden feel so morally bound to
Satisfied.
yeah,
Yeah.
like ultimately, it's poor people who are more exposed to these price increases, and
Mm-hmm.
to deny them of cheap energy is really to deny them of a valid a validating way of life that allows us to move when we want, do all the things that we want. And I feel the same way about people not wanting to finance energy projects in Africa, which that's been a big thing that
Yeah.
I've
It's so
felt.
criminal.
I was like, oh my God, what are we doing? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think the thing that people don't fully appreciate is that being poor is expensive. And that's
Mm-hmm.
because of
Yeah.
proportionality.
Yeah.
That's why you're more
Yes.
vulnerable to price increases because things are already expensive for you. I've lived near the poverty line, and you're praying every day you get in your car that there's not something wrong with it, or that your tire doesn't pop or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't know how you'll be able to make rent if that goes
Yeah.
up. And the way small fluctuations can really impact your ability to even feed yourself. So I think you're right about all of that. I totally support energy projects in Africa. I think some of the COP stuff about putting a damper on that is absolutely insane. But more importantly, I think we got a lot of positive work to do, and I think we're going to do it.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
I
I
want to thank
agree.
you for coming on, man. This
Of
was really, really
course.
great. And I hope it's the
Of
first of
course.
many conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
So
Thank
before we
you.
go, where can people
Yeah.
find
So I talk a lot about uranium investing and energy and the intersection between that on Twitter at MemD Capital is my energy page.
you?
My
Mm-hmm.
personal page is probably a little bit less interesting to folks, but yeah. So MemD Capital, talk a lot about uranium. I've been doing that for 2 years now, and it's a great way to leverage what I think a lot of people who are listening to this podcast already probably appreciate, which is the relative benefits of nuclear power that will be exposed over the coming decades. I think you know being able to monetize that for yourself and to put that back into the community and to hopefully create positive change through your investing in
Mm-hmm.
uranium and energy, and understanding that is something that I'm really passionate about. So MEMD Capital. Yep.
All right, great. Well, people can
All
find
right.
that in the show notes. Aidan, I'll talk to you later. Everybody else, stay strong, stay sharp, and stay radiant, my friends. Till next week.